Well, welcome back to another program. Looks like we got another good crowd today, and we got a great speaker. First of all, though, we have a couple of announcements to make, and Randy Richardson, who's a former contributor, and in fact is going to do our October program in a couple of months, has a couple of things to say.
Thank you, Michael. I wanted to let people know about a cemetery restoration program being offered at Clay County in Center Point, Indiana on Saturday, September the 14th. The primary speaker will be Jeannie Reagan-Denius. She's a fantastic speaker, and she's going to be talking about the laws that govern cemeteries, what you can do as far as cemetery research, and what the guardians of the cemetery should be doing. Fantastic program, and there are some sheets if you would like to register. It's $25 for all day. That's all I got.
That's plenty, thanks. Also, a fellow named James Hutchinson, who's a 94-year-old World War II veteran who flew B-17s, who may give a program here at one time or another, wanted me to make a little announcement that it concerns the Indiana Military Museum in Vincennes. Has anybody been to that before? It's really a neat place, and they've added a new wing to it, I guess. So it's even better than it was before. But they're celebrating the 74th anniversary of the end of World War II on August 31st and September 1st at that Vincennes Museum, and he's one of the speakers there. So he wanted me to mention that. Also, this concerns Enright East, which is an active living community center. It's a pilot program supported by the city. Membership's free throughout the pilot period. However, certain classes will have a small fee. Programs will focus on health, wellness, and social well-being, and will evolve in response to feedback. And Richard Bowen, one of our people back there, and a former Bloomington South graduate, is going to give out these brochures on the way out. That way? I'll be at the front door, and I put some at the back. Okay, you can pick these brochures up there. Now, as is our habit, our Minister of Propaganda has a few wonderful statements to make. Here you are, George.
I told Mike he was supposed to refer to me in the future as the Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to introduce my wife, Mary Carpenter, who has tolerated me for almost 52 years. I'd like to thank you all for being here, and particularly like to thank the Legion for hosting this. Please be generous to our servers. We don't want to have to go pick up our own food in the future. I'd like to thank CATS. CATS is always number one on my list because they help us a lot with archiving the history. How many of you are here for the first time today? Good. If you would like to be on our distribution list, we send an email once a month reminding people of what the programs are going to be. My staff will take care of that. Okay. Okay, so please get on our email list. How many of you have been on YouTube have been on the YouTube to see our list of presentations? That's not nearly enough, people. Seriously, we've got 45 presentations out there. And I really want you to go to YouTube, do a search for Monroe County History Club, and subscribe. If we start getting subscribers, we can do a lot more. It's time to shut up now. Okay, that's all I have to say. You all have a pleasant day. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, double thanks to CATS TV for preserving history here for us. They started doing it for us in November 2015. And I wish I'd thought of it earlier. And we've got 12 more programs scheduled. We'll be up to around 60 on YouTube here before too long. I need to mention my mother, Mary, is here, Mary Carter. There you go, George. And my wife, Paulette. And two of my cousins, Bernie and Penny. Two of them couldn't make it, but two of them could. So thanks, guys. Okay, well, I'll go over the list of programs coming up, and this is the farthest ahead we've ever been scheduled. Next month, September 24th, this will mark the bicentennial month of the First Presbyterian Church in Bloomington, and local historian Owen Johnson will present its history. October 15th, this is what we call a bonus program. There are 5 Tuesdays in October, so sometimes right in the middle we stick one. So October 15th, Brad Cook, who's the curator of IU Photo Archives, will return to show more vintage photos of Bloomington. He's given 5 previous programs, and all of them people really liked. October 29th, Randy Richardson will give a program entitled Once Upon a Time in Monroe County, Stories from Our Past. The earliest stories from 1857, and the latest is about a business that began in 1920 and is still doing well. There'll be something there for the interest of everyone. November 26th, another frequent contributor, Derek Ritchie, will be back, called The Dark Side of Monroe County. He's actually writing a book, and that's why he's doing this, I think. But it's good stuff, I think. The mysteries, murders, and scandals that shocked Bloomington. Derek will relate 6 different shocking things that happened in Bloomington prior to World War II in Monroe County that stunned the community. So that's all we'll tell you, because that's all I know about that. December 17th, we had to move that date back a little bit because of the Christmas holiday. Hillary Fleck of the Monroe County History Center will return and give a program on the women's suffrage movement in Monroe County. 2020 will mark the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. January 28th, local historian and past contributor David Nord will give a program entitled Power, Transport, and Machinery, the Revolution in Flour Milling in Indiana, including Monroe County from 1820 to 1920. February 25th, another past contributor, Duncan Campbell, will discuss the local architect John Nichols, who designed many homes in Bloomington. How many people have heard of John Nichols? Yeah, he was a prolific architect that was a very talented guy, and a lot of his homes got torn down, but a lot of them still remain too. March 31st, Dr. Jake Butler, another former contributor, will give a program on the history of transportation in Monroe County. Now, this is kind of cool. It will cover Native American and early settler paths, water transport, the county's first roads, horse-drawn travel, the rise and fall of the railroad, the advent of the automobile and improved road network, the Monroe County air travel, and finally the additions of highways and eventually the interstate. So that's interesting to me. That's ambitious. April 28th, Michael White and Adam Stillwell of Cats TV will give a program for us on what they do. And people may not know, Cats TV goes back around 45 years, so they've got quite a history in Bloomington. Next guy you've heard of, May 26, 2020, Jeremy Boshears will come back and reprise his program on covered bridges of Monroe County that he did, will be 2.5 years ago, I think, before too long. But this time with much more information. It'll be like a new program. He's got a lot of new photos, a lot of more info. June 30th, Derek Ritchie, that's 2020, will return, give a program called The Demolition of the Morton Hunter Mansion and the Birth of the Preservation Movement in 1974. He will discuss the Hunter, Laboratoe mansions and their importance to our past. July 28th is open. August is open. And it's September 29th, James Capsule, who's here today, I think. Oh, there he is. Also contributed not long ago. We'll give a program called Herman B. Wells, entitled Beyond Being Lucky. Herman B. Wells and Indiana University. That leads us to today. John Summerlot is coming back for another presentation. He did one on the Anderson Memorial last year, almost exactly a year ago. The topic, Servitium Pro Patria, the military history of Indiana University. The military history of IU starts with the Revolutionary War and runs up to our students and staff currently employed overseas. The military and veterans have played crucial roles in the development of IU since the day they founded it. IU's contributions to the military are no less impressive. We'll look at both the military's impact on IU and IU's impact on the military. And he promises us that we'll be surprised with many things we can't believe we never knew. And in addition, he may spend a couple of minutes talking about the search for the elusive time capsule from IU. Some people have read about that in the paper, so he'll talk about that a tiny bit, not much. All right, John?
Thank you. So yeah, I'll start off about the time capsule, but not to dwell on it. So speaking of YouTube, this year for the IU Bicentennial, I work in the Center for Veteran and Military Students. And one of the reasons that I do a lot of this history stuff is for a lot of our student veterans that are on campus, that are in their 20s or early 30s, they may be the only veteran, the only military-connected student in the academic program that they're in. And so we have about 250 or so undergraduate student veterans. We have about 250 graduate students. Those 250 undergrads represent 177 academic programs. So oftentimes they may go an entire day without seeing another student veteran anywhere on campus. And when you're a 27-year-old in a classroom full of 18-year-olds, that can be a little bit of a struggle. So I started doing some of this history research so that I could tell them, hey, you know who this building's named after? Hey, do you know who this is? So that as they walked around campus, they would see and understand and know the military history of our campus, so they wouldn't feel maybe as out of place, or they'd feel a little better connected about what was going on. As part of that, this year for the Bicentennial, we launched a YouTube channel for the Center for Veteran and Military Students. Every Friday, we do a 3-minute history briefing on some aspect of IU history. And it's a real low-budget production. It's usually me and sometimes one of my student workers and a cell phone, and that is me. And so we go to wherever it is and we talk about it. It's a short video, though, so even when it's wobbly, you can get through it. Well, the very first one we did, I happened to talk about the fact that there was also a time capsule, or we believe there to be a time capsule from 1922 that is buried under the Kroger parking lot. It got lost in the process of moving the campus, a whole long story I won't get into, but we have reason to believe that it never got dug up, it never got moved. That was the first YouTube video we did. We put it out, like 6 people watched it. And we were like, this is awesome. And 2 days later, I got 3 phone calls from 3 different news agencies that wanted to do stories about this time capsule. And I was like, I don't know who watches my YouTube videos, but somehow this took off. Next thing I knew, we had, 50-something views on that video. And since then, we have like 10 subscribers. I'm trying to tell my teenagers that I'm a YouTube star now. They don't believe me, so we're kind of working on that. It's an ongoing project because we're not supposed to dig it up until 2022. So we've got a lot of time to plan and think this out as to how we're going to go about getting through the pavement and all the other issues that go along with it. What's interesting is ever since the first couple news stories ran about that, I think almost every day I've had somebody from the community contact me and say, hey, I remember when that plaque was here, or I went to school there and I remember this, or here's a picture of me and my friends from graduation, or my parents at graduation, or my grandparents at graduation, and so as a community, it's become a little bit of a project for putting that together, and it's been good times, even if it's not really something I sort of do on a regular basis. So to the military history side of things, so a little bit of my background, my undergraduate degree is in history. I've done some graduate work in history as well. I served in the military. I served 4 years active duty in the Marine Corps, and I've served now coming up on 13 years in the Guard. And so for me, understanding the military side of campus is about being able to translate between higher ed and the military, both the influence that we've had on the military, but also the influences the military has had on us as a campus. But I also like to preface this with a quote, one of my favorite quotes that comes from William Lowe Bryan. And William Lowe Bryan said, "I covet a true patriotism for the university. No bragging, no pretense that anything is better than it is, no easygoing tolerance of what should not be tolerated, but also the ability to see the greatness before our eyes even when it's here at home. I am for those who see our university as it is, with all its wrinkles and scars, and who therefore also know it at its best. Because the reality of it is, when we talk about anything in 200 years of campus history, it's not always all going to be positive. It's not always all going to be great stories. There's going to be missteps. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be problems. There's going to be things that happen. And I don't run away from that. I kind of embrace that. I'm one of those people that I like to sometimes talk with my students and even non-military students, talk with them about the university's history and say, do you know why this is the way it is? And when they say no, being able to tell them of what some previous students had to fight for or what some obstacle or hurdle was that had to be overcome in order to get there becomes an important piece of that. So to start off with, quick refresher on Indiana history. For those of y'all who haven't had an Indiana history class in a long time, Indiana was largely settled from south to north in the early years. And so at the point where they decided to locate the university in Monroe County, we were literally the furthest north settlement that you could get to in an 1816 map. And if you go to the 1818 map, you can see the northern corner of Monroe County, the northeast corner of Monroe County is still considered Indian territory. It's still owned by Native Americans. And so we are a frontier college. That is the attitude, that is the mentality that shapes who the people are that come to IU in those early years. So you have to wonder, who are some of these early pioneers that said, hey, this looks like a great place to put a college? So one of those was David Maxwell. Maxwell Hall, Maxwell family. A lot of people know that name from around town. David Maxwell was a founding father of IU. He also was a surgeon in the Army in the War of 1812. And he served with a little-known group called the Indiana Rangers. Now, the Indiana Rangers much later got ripped off by another state down south somewhere that I won't name, and made a much more famous group of Rangers based on the same concept of a joint military law enforcement group that basically kept order within the territory. And he was doing that in 1812 before Indiana was a state. Now, if you know anything about the military, one thing you also can go bad, can go wrong for you in many ways. You don't want to have a relationship with your commander beyond your military role, right? So for instance, if you were to say fall in love with your commander's sister and decide to marry her, that may create some awkwardness, or it may spawn a community if that person is Williamson Dunn. So for those of y'all that are familiar with the Dunn family, the Dunns and the Maxwells had intermarried. David had married Williamson's sister. They moved here to Bloomington. Some of the Dunn family moved here with them, hence all of our Dunn Meadows, Dunn Woods, and all those things around campus. Williamson Dunn had been commander of one of those Indiana Rangers units. So this gives you an idea. These are the people that are in the early days of sort of forming the university. Our very first board of trustees, or our first couple of board of trustees, our first 18 folks on the board of trustees, 7 of them had served in the War of 1812. 1 was a West Point alum, 2 were sons of Revolutionary War soldiers, and 1 was raised by George Washington's niece. I just like that last one. It's random. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just a fun one, right? But so, this is the people who are making decisions about what things look like in the university at this point. The frontier militia that exists at this point, our students are a part of it. They are part of the local community militia. They're showing up, they're drilling, they're taking part in it. We also have the Brewster Sisters. For those who aren't familiar with the Brewster Sisters, they are the matriarchs of the founding families of IU. The Alexanders, the Dunns, the Maxwells, the Sewards are all connected back to the Brewster Sisters. The Brewster Sisters had lived in Virginia during the Revolutionary War. Their father was a civilian logistics guy. He was a contractor, provided food and water and meat and horses and all these other things to the Revolutionary Army. And when the Revolutionary Army came through their area of Virginia, these 3 teenage sisters managed to keep their oven going 24 hours a day for 7.5 days to make bread, mend uniforms, and support the Army as it was coming through. And so those sisters then begat this entire generation that becomes the founding generation of Bloomington and of IU. Oh, and guess what? They're buried next to the Union on campus in Dunn Cemetery because they all ended up living here, right? So if you go to Dunn Cemetery today, there's a giant marker on the corner, and with the way the sidewalk is, you'll never know it because this is what you see from the inside. That's actually the sidewalk and the union behind it. So if you don't go around to the other side, you don't read their names that are on it. And so a lot of people have no idea that that's the connection and that's who the women are that are there. So throughout this time period, the students, as I said before, are drilling with the local militia if they're of age. Many of our students at this point are only 14, 15 years old. They're not old enough to drill with the militia. But we decide at one point we're going to hire a new professor of mathematics. And we get this former West Point instructor, former West Point alum named Jacob Amon. Jacob Amon came to teach mathematics, and before he even arrived here, the university wrote to him and said, hey, while you're here, could you also teach military science? And he said, sure, I'd be willing to do that. And so in 1840, he becomes the first professor of military science in the United States. Because prior to that, the only military science that was taught in military academies, West Point, Norwich, VMI, and then a host of high school level military academies. They didn't have to have a professor of military science because everybody was a professor of military science. So he becomes the first person to hold that title. We're also the first school to say, you know what, we're going to teach it without having to have it be a military academy. You can choose to take this class. So it also became IU's first elective. You can choose to take this class, and when you do, you have to stay in it the whole semester. And at the end, we'll give you a grade, we'll do all that stuff. And by the way, you're only going to have to wear a uniform on Saturdays when you show up to do drill and do all this sort of stuff. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, we're about 80 years ahead of what would become the Reserve Officer Training Corps program, or ROTC, in this concept. It just so happens one of several of Jacob Amon's classmates went to other schools like the University of Tennessee. One of them became a faculty member there, so on and so forth. And they started spreading this idea that you could go into a non-military academy, liberal arts institution, and teach military science as an elective because this is a skill that students are going to need. Now, other schools tried this. The University of Virginia tried this. It resulted in armed rebellion amongst the students, and one faculty member was shot and killed. The University of South Carolina tried this. They wound up in a standoff with the local law enforcement, and the president of the university had to stand between them and take everybody's guns away. The University of Georgia had a student rebellion as well, and they said, you know, we're not real sure this is going to work, and so it's not until the military academy days after the Civil War that you start seeing this proliferation of programs that come out of it. Nobody died in our program, just pointing that out. Jacob Amon would go on to become a brigadier general during the Civil War. After the war, he and his brother, who was an admiral, were on the committee that helped lay the Panama Canal. Jacob Amon's legacy lives on our campus today because if you've been to a football game, you've probably seen Big Jake, right? So Jake is the name of the cannon that ROTC fires off at the games, and it's named after Jacob Amon. So forwarding out of the Jacob Amon era, the university took a huge budget cut in 1843. He gets hired away from us because he got his salary slashed by 25%. And so he got hired away. We went back to drilling, working with the local militia for instructors. Students were participating in that. The Mexican-American War happens in the 1840s. And from the Mexican-American War, we get our first student veterans to show up on campus in 1848. So Samuel Buskirk was one of those. The other was Robert Milroy. Robert Milroy would go on to be a major general during the Civil War. Robert Milroy was 6'10", which is gigantic for that size. And his nickname was the Gray Eagle because he grayed very early on in life. And so quite an impressive person. It's an interesting story to read, but he graduated from IU in 1850. Along with Buskirk, they were our first two student veterans to graduate. So when my student veterans come in and they think that, like, you know, well, how long's IU even been doing this? You know, it's like quite a while. I couldn't do this locally without briefly mentioning Morton Hunter. Morton Hunter's also a student during this period. For those that know Morton Hunter, our own homegrown general, you know the story that goes along with that. This is also the period at which he's a student at IU. John Dee Alexander, part of that Alexander family, grew up in the local community, and he is about 14 years old in 1857. And at that point in time, he starts hanging out around the university. He starts seeing a lot of things that are going on and becomes very aware of kind of things in the community. And he left a treasure trove of documents and letters and things that he's kind of written and documented about that time. And so he will actually go on to be a captain he will graduate in 1861 and go on to be a captain during the Civil War. And the university archives, which is where a lot of these pictures come from, but also where a lot of this information comes from, and Dina, the archives director, is hiding in the corner over there. Some of this material was recently donated about a year and a half ago. Yeah, she's shaking her head. Okay, about a year and a half ago, we got this material. This is actually his Civil War sword that he carried during the war. That was not a ceremonial sword. We have his original binoculars. We have his captain's ranks. And then he went on to be the state commander for the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a veterans organization after the war. And he kept these really great scrapbooks of news stories and things that the GAR was involved in and that was happening during that time. So we have those as well. He also provides us an insight as to what life was like in Bloomington during the Civil War. And what was kind of going on. And so he talks about it from a campus standpoint. And the story that he tells, he was a student about ready to graduate in 1861, 1862. And when South Carolina declares secession, the next morning, folks come to campus and they find a red South Carolina secession flag flying from the highest point in the university building. People get upset. People get angry. They go, they tear the flag down, they drag it through the streets to the president's house and demand to know what is going on and why. They then take it from there to the courthouse, where by now they have quite a sizable crowd formed, and they ceremoniously burn the South Carolina secession flag. Now, why would we even end up with that in the first place? Well, when people think about IU, we often think about Indiana students, particularly back then. You don't really think about a lot of transportation and travel and things that were happening. But I'll come back to this in a second. Let me jump to John Lemon. So John Lemon lived in Harrodsburg and moved to right near Seminary Square, Caddy Corner across from Wendy's. Wendy's wasn't there then, just to be clear. But Caddy Corner across from Wendy's, right before the Civil War. He was too young to serve to actually join and serve in the war, but he was allowed to serve in the local guards. And his father was one of the commanders of the Home Guards, the local unit, and one of their jobs was to go through and try and find and protect the railroads from people that may be trying to hurt or harm the railroads and do damage to them. I don't have my quote on that. And one of the things that's really interesting about him, he has this great story about the cavalry at one point came down from Indianapolis, and they had gotten word that there was going to be a big Copperhead meeting. Copperheads and Butternuts were the Southern sympathizers. And he said they had a meeting in a place that he called Secessia, which he then locates as being in Greene County. And so he kind of identifies Greene County as this hotbed of pro-Southern sympathy. And the cavalry comes, they ride past his house, and they head out towards Greene County. They come back the next evening, and they have brought with them 30 weapons, a stockpile of guns and ammo, and other materials that they seized during their raid out to Greene County. And so this is why, if you read the newspapers of the time period, you will read a lot, especially out of Indianapolis, about the conflicts and the Southern sympathizers. This is also the reason that Morgan's raid happened, and he thought he would get a lot of support and a lot of effort when he came into Indiana, because he thought these groups were very prominent. They probably weren't as prominent as the newspapers and others make them out to be, but they were there. These are actually some of the butternuts that he had collected. These are actually in the Lilly Library's collection today. So, a little bit more about the Civil War. So Theodore Reed, son of Daniel Reed, Reed Hall on campus is named after Daniel Reed. Theodore Reed graduated in 1850, joined the Civil War, made it all the way to a brevet brigadier general, and was actually at the Battle of High Bridge 2 days before Appomattox. And was the last brigadier general killed in the Civil War. And it was also the last battle where the commander on both sides was killed. And so but the Battle of the High Bridge was one of the attempts to keep the Confederates from escaping, and probably sealed the deal in a lot of ways to make Appomattox happen and make Lee surrender. Lucien Greathouse. Lucien Greathouse came to IU at the ripe old age of 16 from Illinois. He graduated from IU at the age of 18. He then passed the bar and was practicing law by 19. So he's not a dummy in any sense of the word. So when the war breaks out, he signs up. He's immediately elected a captain. And by the time he's under General Sherman in the March to the Sea, as they're headed to Atlanta, he's a colonel commanding a regiment. He's 22 years old. He's a colonel commanding a regiment. After the war, Sherman says, people ask Sherman, who's the bravest person you knew in the war? And he says, I can't tell you that. Everybody was brave. That's too much to ask. And he says, no. You got to tell us somebody. Who was the bravest person you knew? And he said, if you had to ask me, Lucien Greathouse was the bravest of the brave. Lucien Greathouse died in the Battle of Atlanta trying to seize a schoolhouse just north of Atlanta, leading the charge of his regiment with the colors in his hand as a colonel. 2 days later, Sherman received orders to promote him to brigadier general. He would have been the youngest brigadier general in American military history. Graduated from IU. John Watson Foster, Foster Residence Hall on campus, some of y'all may be familiar with. John Watson Foster served as a colonel during the war, or up to colonel during the war. After the war, went on to be ambassador to 4 or 5 different places, Spain and Russia and a number of things. Was Secretary of State at one point as well. He was Secretary of State when a big scandal involved, and we wound up taking the territory of Hawaii by overthrowing the monarchy there. And that was the tail end of his administration. And he couldn't figure out what to do with it in order to hand it back off or settle things with Hawaii to try and give it back or figure out what we wanted to do with it. So one of the things that he got stuck with is this reputation for that. But what he really did that I think is probably a more lasting legacy, besides the fact that I love Hawaii and Hawaiian shirts, what's really the more lasting legacy is that after he was Secretary of State, he opened a law firm in Washington, D.C., and that law firm specialized in representing corporate interests to government folks, particularly senators and congressmen. They used to hang out in a lobby of a hotel to do this. The first lobbyists, yes. So now nobody likes him, I get it, okay. All right. Richard Owen, Owen Hall. Richard Owen was part of the New Harmony Owens and that family. And Richard Owen was a geologist by training and did a lot of survey and map work for early geologists for the state of Indiana. His brother was actually a faculty member at IU, and he was technically his brother's assistant, but both of them worked as faculty. And when the Civil War came, he was actually the first faculty member to take a military leave of absence. So he said, I want to go fight in the war. They said, go do it. When you come back, you'll have your job. We'll put you back in. And he was made a colonel. And he was put in charge of the prison camp outside of Indianapolis. And he had this, Camp Morton, and he had this radical idea at the time that prisoners that are coming here from the South in particular may not be prepared for an Indiana winter. And therefore, they may need blankets. They may need buildings that have insulation. They may need food. And he also had this radical idea of letting the sergeants, the NCOs, take care of all the minor discipline in the camp. And then thirdly, he had this idea that we could lease them out and let them do little jobs in the community to make money, to make the food better, to make the conditions better in the camp. Now, those don't sound all that radical today, but for Civil War era prison camps, that was radical ideas. All those things are now part of the Geneva Convention for prisoners of war that you have to abide by as a signee of the Geneva Convention. Well, after a few months of doing this, he gets deployed to the front, gets put in charge of a unit, and his unit gets surrounded and captured by Simon Bolivar Buckner. And when the Confederates capture him, they said, hey, we heard about how you treat our prisoners. We heard about what you do up there. And in recognition of that, your men can turn in their arms and they are paroled and they can go home. That is how radical this treatment was of prisoners at that time. And if that doesn't convince you of how radical it was, after the war, the Confederates all get together and they're all sharing stories about, oh, my prison camp was worse than your prison camp, and all these sort of things that veterans do when we get together, right? And they're talking about, how bad things were. And all of a sudden, these guys start realizing, hey, we had it really nice. Like, that was amazing, right? Like, I didn't realize how bad some of these other folks had it. So in the 1920s, the few of them that were still alive and still remain, they decided to pass the hat, and they were going to have a statue made and given to the state of Indiana of Richard Owen. And they hired the daughter of a Confederate officer, a sculptor named Belle Kinney, to do that sculpture. And so that sculpture was originally given to the state of Indiana. In the 1930s, they made 2 copies of it. They gave one to IU and one to Purdue, and I'll talk about why Purdue here in a second. But a copy of this stands in the Union today. It's in the doorways of the main Union area. It is the only statue in the U.S. paid for and made by Confederates of a Union officer, because that's how they felt about this. Now, the reason there's one at Purdue, so after the war, when they decided to start that other institution up there, they decided they needed a faculty member, and who better than a geologist? And so they took Richard Owen to be the first president of Purdue University. They didn't have a campus, they didn't have any plan, so he's kind of overseeing the plan, putting things in motion. And when the time came that they said, okay, we're going to open the campus, we need you to move up to West Lafayette, he said, no thanks, I'll resign, I'll stay here at IU. So the first president of Purdue was an IU faculty member the entire time, so just keep that in mind. So I'm doing a Civil War presentation up in Carmel next month, and the guy that's hosting it, that's running it, is a Purdue alum, and he goes, then I'm going to do this, even though you're talking about IU, and I told him, no, don't worry, I got a Purdue fact in there for you. So, yeah, he's going to be super excited. So as I mentioned before, when you think about Indiana in this time and you think about transportation, most people think of local Indiana residents as being our primary population, and that was true. Most of our students did come from Indiana, but even prior to the war, these red bars, or prior to the war, you can see we had 5.1% of our students that came from what would become Confederate states. 8% of our students came from border states, so 13% of our students were coming from the South. Because the Mississippi River and the Ohio River were the main transportation ways, we were pulling students from Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi that were coming up to IU to go to class, because we were the first back east institution that you could hit when you came up the river to head back this way. Most of these are students of privilege. These are planter sons. These are folks who have the money to travel that far to go to school. Not entirely different than today in some ways. And so that affects who some of the Confederates are that wind up coming out of IU. Richard Taylor Allison, who is the nephew of President Taylor, comes to IU. After he graduates from IU, he joins the U.S. Navy. He's part of the expedition to open up Japan and trade with Japan. And when the Civil War breaks out, he resigns his commission in the U.S. Navy, goes to the Confederate military, and becomes the paymaster of the Confederate Marine Corps. So Churchill Crittenden, if you've read 1800s history, you've run across the Crittenden name. There's like 4 governors, 3 senators, and all sorts of politicians and folks that are involved with the Crittenden name. Yes, that Crittenden family is who I'm talking about. Churchill actually grew up in California and was sent back east to get his education. He was actually at Hanover first, and he was at Hanover, and the Civil War starts breaking out, and his parents were like, don't get involved, don't do anything. He made some bad choices, got asked to leave Hanover, and so he walked up the street and came to us. And so we had him as a student briefly, and his parents were like, look, if you're going to keep making bad choices, we're just going to draw the line, and we're going to tell you to leave the country. And so they took him and his brother and told him to leave the country and go to Europe, and they were sending him to stay with family in Europe. Crittenden and his cousin jumped ship in Cuba, made their way across to Florida, and joined the Confederate military. Crittenden would later be caught. He was a private, but he was really good at scrounging up materials and food and those sort of things. He was later caught roaming away from his unit, scrounging up food and supplies. He wound up being executed as a spy, even though he was in full uniform. So back to that laws of war thing, that's not how being a spy works. If you're in full uniform, you're not a spy. The colonel that was responsible for that was forced to resign, forced to retire by the hand of President Lincoln. because that's the power the Crittenden family had even during the war. And then Obadiah Jennings Wise. Obadiah gets, first off, my vote for best hat of any photo that I have in the Civil War. But Obadiah Jennings Wise is one of the children of the Wise family. Henry Wise was governor of Virginia before the war, slave owner, very pro-secession, would later go on to be an ambassador, a number of other things. And he was in love with Andrew Wiley. He thought Andrew Wiley was the best faculty member. Andrew Wiley was a rock star. He sent all of his sons, all of his nephews, and any other random family members that he could. He paid for their education to go to wherever Andrew Wiley was teaching at, which meant that some of them went to school in Pennsylvania when he taught there, and when he came to IU, they all came to IU as well. And so this is really one of the prominent first families of Virginia that is sending folks here. Obadiah is kind of an interesting character, though. He comes from a background of a lot of wealth and privilege, and so he wrote a few letters home that his family kept, and this is one of my favorite observations about life in Bloomington. This was in about 1850 or so, 1849. The chief objection I have to this town is that the people are so extremely bigoted against dancing. Last winter, when we had dances here, we always had to go out into the country for girls. As to getting one of the town ladies to shake her foot, that was decidedly out of the question. The Presbyterians declared that it was wicked, the Baptists that it was awful, and the good Methodist brethren denounced our ballroom for a young hell, and that the fiddler was the devil himself and every dancer was an imp. Yeah. Yeah. So he didn't really hide a lot, which makes him also an interesting person to read about. After he graduated, he went to serve in a delegation, Secretary of State sort of role, working in an embassy in Germany and then France. He started off in Germany, where he began an inappropriate relationship with the wife of the Brazilian minister, for which he was then moved to France. In France, he began an inappropriate relationship with the wife of one of the French secretaries that was there. And the State Department said, "You can't do this, we're sending you home." He came back to America with 400 bottles of wine and the statement that I have seen all the best parts of Germany through the bottom of a beer glass. So, when the Civil War broke out, his father had bought him a newspaper, and he was running the Richmond newspaper. And he was also doing double duty for his father, who was governor of Virginia at the time. When John Brown's raid happened, he's reporting live from the scene back to both his father and his newspaper. He's there watching the trial, watching the capture, following everything that happens with John Brown's raid. Civil War starts. Being somebody that's not necessarily going to end up on the front lines and in a dangerous place, his father helps him form a unit called the Richmond Light Blues, which is basically a ceremonial unit. They're a cavalry unit. Their job is to ride around and drum up business for recruiting and these sort of things. They actually get in one battle the entire war, and he's killed in that one battle during the war. But Obadiah, lots of interesting reading. If you want, I can send you the sources. So I mentioned Hawaii earlier, and I mentioned that John Foster got handed Hawaii from some issues that were going on politically. The Secretary of State that followed him was Walter Q. Gresham, and Gresham got handed Hawaii. So we had two Secretary of States in a row in the late 1800s that were IU alums. Walter Gresham had been a student here. He was a brigadier general during the Civil War, and he made a lot of friends. His wife was from Kentucky and grew up in a slave-owning family in Kentucky. Can't read it if I drop it. And grew up in a slave-owning family in Kentucky. And so throughout the war, he has those awkward Thanksgiving dinners with his family where he's a brigadier general in the Union Army, and his father-in-law is the person helping organize Morgan's raid into Indiana. Suddenly my Thanksgivings seem really cool, right? So this is a situation that he's in throughout that time. At the Battle of Vicksburg, the siege of Vicksburg, he writes home to his wife, and he says, when the siege ended, when they surrendered, I went over to their works immediately in our front and found several old college mates. One of them, O'Reilly, captain of a battery, almost shed tears. He recognized me as soon as he saw me and came running to me and exclaimed, What? My God, is that you? Have we been fighting each other? I wouldn't have killed you and known it for the world. The whole party seemed to rejoice to meet me, and I believe they were sincere. O'Reilly had a magnificent battery, and although I hate treason and will never compromise with it as long as I live, I could not help feeling bad for him, for with me the ties of friendship have always been strong. So we literally have IU alums running into each other during these battles, finding themselves on opposite sides as a piece of this. Speaking of opposite sides, what's this moment? Anybody? Appomattox, the surrender at Appomattox, the ultimate meeting of the two sides. And although there's lots of paintings and pictures of this, and everybody argues over how many what, where Union folks were in the room at various points, and I've read through the actual accounts of the people that were there, everybody agrees there were only 2 Confederates in the room during this. So interestingly enough, how then do you wind up with IU on both sides? William McKee Dunn. William McKee Dunn had been elected to Congress and was serving in Congress at the outbreak of the war, been a lawyer before that. And in contrary to how politicians work today, every time Congress takes a recess, he gets on his horse, he rides out to the nearest battlefield, finds a general, and volunteers as an aide to the general. Now you can imagine today, a politician hopping on a plane, flying to Iraq or Afghanistan, being like, I'm here for the weekend, what can I do to help, right? This is basically what he's doing in a lot of ways, right? Well, eventually, because he is an anti-slavery politician, he ends up not getting reelected to his southern Indiana district. So he just rides out one day and says, okay, I'm here for good now. What can I do? And so they make him a captain, and he becomes an aide to a number of key players during that time. When word comes to Grant's command that Lee is looking to surrender, he sends out 2 people to go meet him and find him. And if you've heard the story, you know they find Lee sitting under an apple tree in an orchard. There were 3 Union folks that came up. Dunn was one of those folks that rode up and got General Lee and took him to the courthouse in Appomattox where it was going to be signed. He was there during the whole rest of the time. So he's there as all this happens. He goes on to make a career out of the Army after having been a politician, rises to the rank of Brigadier General. He's the 2nd Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army. On the flip side, Charles Marshall, General Lee's secretary, his personal secretary throughout the war, the only other man that's there on the Confederate side, former IU faculty member. Had taught mathematics at IU for about 6 years in the mid-40s and had gone back south, didn't like being in an abolitionist area up in the north. And during the war rises to be General Lee's personal secretary. So IU is the only institution besides West Point that's represented on both sides in this picture. After the war, we started this whole thing up of military science again, but by now land-grant colleges, the Purdue's and the whatnot of the world exist, and the Army's tasked with supplying them, and the Army says, we don't have enough people to supply military science instructors to all these folks. And Congress makes a special rule, you can pick 10 non-land grant schools to supply people to. Well, guess who gets to be one of those 10? We do. Guess who gets the senior most instructor in the entire U.S. Army military science program? We do. We get the only general. General Eli Long comes as our military science instructor after the war. He lasts about a year, and then they send him back east to do a bunch of work. And instead, they send out Lieutenant Colonel James Thompson. James Thompson is still the senior instructor in the entire Army military science program system. He teaches at IU from 68, 69 through 73, roughly. During that time, he serves as professor of mathematics, professor of military science, and professor of civil engineering. I always want to get these throwback T-shirts that says like IU Civil Engineering Program, just to wear when I go places, right? And so this is also one of those history nerd problems that every time we talk about how we now have this intelligent systems engineering program, and our folks are like, we got our first engineering program at IU. I'm like, no, we didn't. So what do we know about what's happening then? What's this military science stuff look like back then? Well, we know a little bit. This is the advertisement from the 1870s newspaper. Yes, it does say Indiana State University. We had an identity crisis in the 1870s We were the State University of Indiana. We were Indiana State University. We were the University of the Indiana State. Like, we didn't know what we were, but we tried a lot of things during that time, so you'll see a lot going on. It says the college term begins on Monday, the 1st of January. A full corps of competent instructors will be present, including a professor of civil engineering and military science. Talks a little bit about the law school. This is my favorite part. Tuition free in all departments. So, yeah, and these were advertisements that we ran in the newspapers around Indiana during that time. Now, one of the other pieces that happens while James Thompson is here, his son attends IU for 1 year before getting appointed to West Point. John T. Thompson. John T. Thompson came up through the Bloomington school system, goes to IU for a year. Some of y'all may know John T. Thompson. He goes on to be a brigadier general during World War I, but if you know him, you probably know him for his most famous invention, known as the Tommy gun. Thompson submachine gun, preferred weapon of 1920s gangsters, if you've ever watched any of those films. So, former IU student. By the 1870s, we start to see students voting with their feet, and this cultural divide sort of breaks up between institutions, and you start seeing students that want to go to farmers' colleges, that want to get their hands dirty. They go to land-grant colleges, and the military starts to be associated with that dirty farmer work, that land-grant sort of work. And so you get students that are saying, no, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer, I don't want to study that stuff. And so you get a little bit of this class divide that sort of breaks up. And by the 1870s, students are choosing to not enroll in military science as much anymore. And so the program sort of slowly fades out through the 1870s. So from the 1870s to the 1890s, we don't have a military science program. We have students that are involved with the local, what would become the National Guard, the local state militia units, and some of that sort of work. But in the 1890s, the Spanish-American War breaks out. Suddenly, students want to volunteer again. They want to be a part of this. And one of those students is Willis O. Tyler. Willis is a local student, grew up here in Bloomington in the area. His aunt was actually a servant at Wiley House. And the family was originally from Bedford. But Willis Tyler comes to school, drops out of school to go serve in the Spanish-American War, and then turns around and comes back. So not only is he our first African-American veteran, he's our first African-American student to take time out to go serve in the military, to turn around and come back. Afterwards, as a veteran, he goes on to win the state oratorical contest, goes to Yale Law School, and becomes one of the first civil rights lawyers out in California. We also started this thing in the 1890s. The Indiana Daily Student thought it would be a good idea to publish a list of all of the students currently serving in the Spanish-American War. And so they started compiling this list of who's out there right now, who's serving. And a couple days after that, somebody obviously had said, well, who served in the Civil War? And they said, I don't know, let's make a list of the Civil War too. And so this is the list of people they knew that had served in the Civil War. So that list has about 25 or so names on it. We now know there are over 350 IU-connected students that served in the Civil War. This is a very early first attempt, right? Student newspaper, they're trying to put this stuff together. Throughout the early 1890s, the Alumni Association and some other groups get involved with it, and we start compiling something called the Roll of Honor. It becomes this list of all of the IU students who have served in the military, and they go all the way back to honoring David Maxwell in the War of 1812, but they make this list of every student they can find that has served in the military. Well, then what happens? World War I. World War I happens. Now, all of a sudden, there's a lot of students to keep track of, a lot of former students to keep track of. The registrar takes on the job. It becomes an official function of the president's office to maintain this list and keep this list of who the folks are that are serving. Also, during World War I, the National Defense Act of 1916 gets passed, creates the Reserve Officer Training Corps program. And so when it creates ROTC as a program, we raise our hand, we're like, yeah, we want one of those, and along with a bunch of other schools in the country, and all of the Army says we can't supply everybody all at once. So you're not gonna get an instructor for a while. You're gonna have to figure out what to do. It's 1916, maybe by spring 1917, we'll be able to get you an instructor. They didn't, it was really a couple months into 1917 before they did, but never one to take that as a challenge. K.P. Williams, who was a faculty member in the math department and a lieutenant in the National Guard, said, it's okay, I got you. And he went out as a faculty member and organized the ROTC program, started drilling and training the students. He goes all the way through World War II, goes up to be a colonel. He writes a really long treatise I don't understand on planetary orbit mathematics. I did check it out from the library. If anybody's interested, you can try to read it. But he writes that. He also writes a 4-volume history of Lincoln Finds a General about the Civil War as a piece of that as well. And so K.P. Williams becomes the founding father of the ROTC program, but he's also an IU faculty member, and that plays big into some of the IU history. When we started ROTC program, maybe obliviously, maybe just didn't really think it through, maybe didn't know any different. We were a racially integrated university at that point. Nobody told us that African Americans could not be officers in the Army. Don't know if we just didn't know that or we just ignored it, but when we said all freshmen and sophomore men have to take ROTC, we didn't make any exception for African Americans. And so they were serving in the ROTC. One of the very first ones I've tracked down is Wilson Eagleson. His father was the first African American athlete at IU. He would later go on to marry Frances Marshall, as in Neil Marshall Center on campus. And so he's in 1916, he's one of the very first students to sign up and participate in ROTC. He also ran track. This is his track photo. So he goes on and serves during World War I. Speaking of serving in World War I, we had an alumni, Elder Watson Diggs, who in 1918 was in the first camp of African American officers that the Army allowed. So the first time they allowed African American officers or African Americans to train to become officers, they held a camp in Iowa, about 600 folks that graduated from that camp to be officers in African American units. And Elder Watson Diggs was in that very first class. Wouldn't be significant, I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit here, but in 1942, when the Army Air Corps decided they were gonna allow African Americans to be pilots, Charles Deebo, a former IU student, is in the very first class of African American officers that graduate to become what would be known as the Tuskegee Airmen. There are only 5 of them. He's one of them. 1944, Grammy Martin's in the Navy as an enlisted guy, and the Navy says, we're going to allow African Americans to be officers in the Navy. We're going to choose 13 of you. All of them make it through. He becomes one of the Golden 13. Every time the U.S. military has decided to commission African American officers, IU alumni have been in that class, whether it's 5, 13, or 600. Because that's the impact of having had this program that worked with ROTC and allowed the racial integration from an early day. So one of the other things that happened during World War I is we had to figure out what we're going to do with all these students. The Army didn't want everybody dropping out of college at once and trying to join. They knew it might be a long war. They wanted to draw it out. So they started a program called SATC, which is kind of a wartime campus training program. These are our students volunteering in mass. Almost every single able-bodied male student on campus joined SATC, both black and white, joined SATC. We had a racially integrated SATC unit, which really confused the Army. We wrote a letter to the Army and we said, is it okay if we house the African-American students separate? Can they have their own barracks? And you can literally hear in the response back from the Army like, wait, you got what? So nobody told the Army we were a racially integrated institution when they put an SATC unit here. And so they said basically, you guys can do what you do, okay, whatever you want to do, go ahead. We'll work on it, right? And so that's how many of them wound up being in this first class or the first few classes of African American officers in the Army, because we were the only school that was allowing them to participate and be a part of these programs. So most of the student body for $40 a month in a uniform and 3 hots and a cot, 3 meals and a place to sleep, joined the Army. And how do you house that many soldiers on a college campus? Well, you start converting fraternity houses into barracks. So you can imagine taking your average fraternity house and saying, okay, all right, you guys are now Alpha Company. Does anybody see this going wrong anywhere? You guys are Alpha Company, you guys are Bravo Company, right? So SATC barracks number 11, I believe this was actually the Delta Upsilon house at the time. They didn't actually move anybody, they just kept them all in the same place as they went to do this, which obviously, can create some issues. How do you turn your campus into a military when you don't have a PA system? You get something called a Grant megaphone, right? Side note, this is the side of Sample Gates where Bryan Hall is. This is roughly where the provost's office is today. The provost really likes this photo because this is like that spot has been the voice of campus, you know, for a while. But anyway, this is actually on a turntable, and so when you play it, you can actually turn it to make the sounds go all the way across campus during that time. Now, keep in mind the Union was as far as campus was at that point. It wasn't much past that. So we had our own, we needed some training equipment as an SATC. We had a medical unit, we had an artillery unit, we had an infantry unit, and we had an armor unit. So back to the bad ideas. Why would you give students a tank? Yeah, they get tanked from time to time. This is them driving that tank down Kirkwood Avenue. It was a parade in their defense. However, you could imagine if students drove a tank down Kirkwood today. Different time, different place. We also saw some of our women starting to serve for the first time. Lorena Ivy Degner is one of my favorites because she is our first woman veteran to serve in 2 branches of service. She served in the Navy at the start of World War I, and when the Navy phased out women towards the end, she jumped ship and joined the Army. Literally jumped ship. It's a pun. Okay. Jumped ship, joined the Army. Thanks. She joins the Army, and she spends another 1.5 years after the war serving in the Army. After the war, we get our own American Legion post on campus. Sorry to the one out here. It didn't last long, luckily, so then they just started coming out here. And then we decided we needed to figure out something to do about memorials. We really wanted to do something. We knew we needed some buildings. We knew we needed to raise some money. But wouldn't it be really nice if we had a memorial to all of these military folks that have served in the U.S. military? So we had a mass meeting or two, made the decision we were going to start something called the Memorial Fund. The Memorial Fund's responsible for 3 things. Memorial Stadium, the original 10th Street Stadium, for those that remember it. And if you're curious, yes, we moved the name to 17th Street, but if you go to 17th Street today and you look right over the corner back on the wall, right over here on the back wall, you will actually see the original inscription stones from the 10th Street Stadium that are in the wall back there. When they moved it over is when it became Memorial Stadium. And that's part of the legacy. That was 1924 that we built it. We also built Memorial Hall, the first residence hall for women on campus in 1925. And if you go in Memorial Hall, you'll see this is in the front entryway foyer. It's a big bronze medallion that says it's dedicated to the women of the university who served in the war. I talked to a monument historian who's a World War I expert, but really does monuments. He has a giant database of war monuments all over the country. And I said, what's the oldest monument to women that served in the military? And he went into his database and he comes back and he says, there's a grove of trees in Kansas that was planted in 1921. And I said, well, this was built in 1925. And he goes, well, then you would be second. And I said, no. We are the first structure dedicated to women who served in the military. Always about how you spin it. So we also built the Indiana Memorial Union out of that. And so that's why all of them have memorial in the name. Memorial Fund drove all this. At this point, William O'Brien said, hey, we got this list that's been floating around. Wouldn't it be good if we actually wrote it all down and put it in a giant book? He is a small man, but that is a large book. And so we decided to write all the names in the book. It became known as the Golden Book. We put it in a big fancy case in the Union, where it has sat almost ever since, other than we took it out in World War II and added the World War II names. We put this big bronze medallion in the front entryway of the Union, which was a site for a number of things over the years. And then in the 1960s, we decided to move it all into the memorial room, which had been a chapel before that. So if you're ever in the Union and you go to Starbucks, walk across the hallway, and you'll see the memorial room over there, and that's where that stuff lies at today. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. It's also now digitally scanned. There's a giant iPad. You can flip through the pages and look at the pages in it, or you can go online, and we have an online database for it as well. We started allowing women to participate in military science in the 1920s, which was a radical thing too. They contacted the Army and they said, we need to know the specifications for women's uniforms. And they said, we don't have women's uniforms because we don't allow women to participate. So the women came up with their own standards based on what the men's were and started developing their own. Now, they were serving very gender stereotype sort of roles at this point for what they were allowed to do. They really functioned as auxiliaries and social hostesses and some of this, but there was a fair number of them that were involved, and they weren't going to take no for an answer when they were told they couldn't participate in marching band. You guys may be familiar with the IU marching, the ROTC marching band. They were limited to 100 during this point. They marched a lot. They became known as the Marching 100. So, yeah. So my other fun game I play is how everything at IU connects back to the military. And so it's always 2 degrees of separation. I can connect it back to the military in some way. So yeah, the marching band started off as the ROTC band. When the ROTC band would not allow them to participate, they said, that's fine, we'll make our own. And they went off and formed their own drum, bugle, and fife corps as part of it as well. This process continued on of women participating all the way through World War II. And so if you look at any of the pictures during the 20s and 30s, you'll see this as a reoccurring theme, that women are participating quite heavily. We even had a women's rifle team that competed intercollegiately. It was one of our first intercollegiate women's sports that went out and competed against other schools. Because we used to have a rifle range in the basement of the Union. Fun fact. Yep. So December 7th, 1941, World War II breaks out. December 12th, 1941, the first American attack back on the Japanese happens outside of the Philippines, where they had begun inching their way into the Philippines. The flight leader, the wingman of the flight leader on that first flight to attack the Japanese was Russell Church. Russell Church was a 1930s graduate of IU, had been on the swim team, was a pilot with the Army Air Corps at that point. And when they lead this attack, his plane gets hit. It's a dive bomber. He's unable to pull up, but still continues to make a strafing run, takes out 4 or 5 of their planes, a hangar and a tower, before he crashes his plane and dies. Word gets back to the university that about 7 days after Pearl Harbor, that we've already lost our first student in the war. And all of a sudden, this changes the attitude of the university. It goes from a national tragedy to being a personal tragedy very quickly overnight. So first thing that we do right after that is we make another service flag. And so this is the World War II service flag on the day it was dedicated. It's Herman Wells standing down there dedicating it. And you'll notice, you can't tell because it's a black and white photo, the top star is gold stars, the bottom is blue. Because they realized they couldn't fit 5,000 stars on one flag. They just started putting numbers on it. But Herman Wells points out that they have 52 gold stars. This is spring 1942. We already have 52 gold stars, 52 alumni and students that have been killed in the war. And he points out that we only had 52 that died in all of World War I. And he wants to put it in perspective for what this war is going to look like for the students at that point. So we become a training base once again. The Navy comes back to the university as they had in World War I. They start off at first sending men here for training. They take over Collins Living Learning Center, Men's Residence Center. They redub it the Ship. And eventually they start sending women. Why? Because we're no stranger to having women in uniform. It's not a weird thing on our campus. So the WAVES, the Women's Auxiliary I'll figure that one out later. The WAVES, the auxiliary for the women. In the Navy, they start doing a lot of training here. And if you look real closely in this picture, you can also see some women Marines off to the side over here, and these on the end, and there's some over here that are SPARs, which are the Coast Guard women that are here as well. And so we become a training site for them. We make an attempt at creating an Army Air Corps unit during the war. If you look real closely at this photo, though, you'll notice that it's really hard to fly a plane that's stuck in the mud. So the Monroe County Airfield was a dirt field at that point. The Army Air Corps sent some folks in to come inspect it, see if they'd be able to put a training unit here. The plane stuck in the mud and slightly crashed on landing. They said no, we would not have an Army Air Corps unit until after the war because we had a dirt field. But that wasn't for lack of trying. We had students that would form their own flying clubs. They would do all sorts of things in order to get their own training and stuff in. Lawton Shank, I include this one just because it's a fun, well, not fun, but an interesting story. Lawton Shank graduated from the ROTC program and earned a reserve commission back in the 1940s, or late 1930s. However, that didn't guarantee that you would actually get to serve in the military. It was like, oh great, you're a reserve second lieutenant, we'll call you if we need you. There was no sort of reserve obligation like there is today. So as a civilian, he got a job working for Pan American Airways. And he was actually stationed on Guam and a number of places throughout the South Pacific. And as the Japanese came and invaded those islands in the South Pacific, he was right in the middle of it as a civilian medical doctor working for an airline in the South Pacific. When they went to invade Guam, when they went to invade Guam, one of the first targets that the Japanese went after was the hospital itself. And they bombed the hospital repeatedly. They kept trying to destroy the hospital. Shank runs in and out of the hospital throughout a 5-hour attack, rescuing patients, rescuing equipment, running in and grabbing anything they need repeatedly under enemy fire from aircraft and other things during that time. The Marines that were there with him were so impressed by this. The Marines that were there put him in for the Congressional Medal of Honor. And Congress said, we can't give it to a civilian. And this whole thing of being a reserve second lieutenant suddenly came up. They finally settled on awarding him the Navy Cross. He's the only civilian ever awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest honor for heroism in the military. So what did campus look like during the war? Well, here's a quick picture. This is our student body, all in uniform out here. Those are students too, likely, maybe, not sure. This is homecoming. So this gives you an idea of what our military to student ratio was during World War II. And what was going on. Now, some of this was ROTC program, some of this was a program called the ASTP, where the Army was sending folks here for specialized training, largely in foreign languages, physics, and communications. And so we had folks that were here doing that as well. Yeah, I love it. You get the right group of folks in town. You put this picture up, everybody's like, "Oh, I've seen that." Yeah. So, yeah. So after the war, we had to figure out what to do with all the veterans that came back, and how are we going to house them? And so people in town probably recognize this. This is one of the trailer parks, trailer cities that we developed in town. These were surplus trailers that we grabbed from military bases all over the country. That was actually IU's first family housing. This was the first time we offered housing for families. There were spouses and children that lived in these. One of them was converted into being a daycare center so that they would be able to take care of small children while parents went to class and did those sorts of things. These are really small. They are not big. And I say this every time I put this picture up. I would love to find one of these. So if any, they're probably all falling down. They're probably all in horrible shape. And everybody knows somebody that has one as a hunting thing out in Brown County. That's okay. I would love to find one of these. I don't have any money to buy it or restore it, but where there's a will, there's a way. And I would love to stick one back out in the middle of the intramural field today. Rec Sports doesn't, but I do. So. How? Over 500, Dina says. This was just one, yeah. There was actually where the Alumni Center is today and where the tailgate fields are and where Templeton Elementary is. We had trailer parks all over town that we had put up. In fact, we were so desperate for housing. There's a great picture that's in the archives of a student that had waited so long for housing, he gave up and started building his own house. And he is literally just like cinder blocks and tar paper and like building his own house as well. That's how bad the housing shortage was. This is the Herman Wells's conference room. This is the president's conference room. This gives you an idea of how bad housing was. The president's conference room got turned into a barracks or a residence hall for folks to live in. And there's some great stories from the students that live there about how they'd get up every morning and President Wells would be coming in and asking them how they're doing, and they would make coffee and they would get coffee from the president and stuff like this. They got to use his private bathroom as their bathroom. So. One of the things that happened during the war as well was that we banned Japanese Americans from attending IU. We weren't the only school to do this. There were a lot of schools that did, but we did that during the war. And after the war, when Japanese American veterans started applying for admission to IU, Herman Wells went back to the Board of Trustees and said, are we really going to deny veterans? Because that was a whole different political animal than denying Japanese Americans from attending IU. and they caved, and they allowed them in. And so it's two of the first Japanese-American veterans that we have managed to track down that attended. And we had a student last year before last now? When is it? Yeah, last year. We had an IU student that did a huge research project on this. It was recently published in the Indiana Magazine of History. So if you go to their website, you look for Eric Langowski, you'll find a great article about this. Ted Tsukiyama and Kiyoshi Ota were two of our first Japanese-American veterans that came. So Ted Tsukiyama was actually enrolled at the University of Hawaii when Pearl Harbor happened. And the ROTC unit at in Hawaii was the only ROTC unit that's recognized as ever having seen combat. And he was part of that unit. And so after the war, he wound up coming to IU. He later went to law school, then went back to Hawaii, became a lawyer in Hawaii, was real involved in civil rights and some other things out there. But in a really cool sort of twist, was involved in the movement to bring the bonsai trees to America. And was an early proponent of bonsai and keeping the little bonsai trees. And so he is actually, as far as we know, as of a few months ago, he is 99 years old and still alive in Hawaii. Eric and I got a great picture of him. He was briefly in the hospital for some illness, and it's a great picture of him in his hospital bed with an IU t-shirt on. Kiyoshi Ota would go on to be a photographer and went to work for the Postal Service and worked for the post office for the rest of his life till he retired. Howdy Wilcox. Folks know that name? If you do, what do you know about Howdy Wilcox? Little Five, right? Howdy Wilcox, the founding father of Little Five. Or Major General Howard Wilcox, who was a commander of 38th Infantry Division here in Indiana. World War II vet, stayed in a career in the National Guard, wound up retiring as a two-star general. That's the Howdy Wilcox that I also know that you don't see mentioned anywhere. Well, how did he get the idea for Little Five? He saw folks racing bikes around buildings and around areas on campus. His father had been a Little 500 or Indy 500 driver, and so he had this idea for an Indy 500 type of race on bikes. Well, who were those students that he saw doing this? They were veterans, and some non-veterans too, I'm sure, but they were veterans, some of which were racing around Quonset huts and some of those sort of things that we had as military surplus on campus after the war. In the 1930s, Joseph Butcher graduated from IU. He would serve in the Marine Corps for his whole career. And shortly after the war, he becomes the two-star general who was on the negotiation committee for the Korean armistice. And so what ended the Korean War, the Korean armistice, he is one of the negotiators on it. He's an IU alum. He would later come back and run the sesquicentennial campaign for IU. 1970, the Army finally says, you know what, we'll allow women to participate in ROTC. We've decided it's going to be okay, we're going to let that happen, but we're only going to let 10 schools do it as a pilot. I'm sure you already know where this is going. Name one of the 10 schools that got chosen as a pilot. Yeah, IU, right? So next year they said, okay, everybody can do this. Well, with that 1 year head start in 1974, we became the first school in the country to commission a woman out of ROTC. So Pamela Woodley, now Pamela Woodley Davis, was commissioned out of Air Force ROTC in 1974. She went on to serve a career in the Air Force and the Air National Guard. She retired as a lieutenant colonel, lives in Kennesaw, Georgia. Had a chance to meet her and talk with her. We also got another veterans group on campus. The DAV had a chapter, Disabled American Veterans, and these Vietnam vets were largely lobbying for access to buildings. We were not a handicap accessible or a wheelchair accessible facility at that point, and it makes a really dramatic statement when you're a veteran in a wheelchair and you can't get to class and all your veteran buddies show up and carry you up the stairs every day to get you to class, and they show up afterwards and carry you down. That sends a very political statement, and so they lobbied hard to get accommodations on campus that we have today. We continue to teach foreign languages from World War II all the way through today. We continue to be a foreign language program for the military. All the way up through the 1970s, we actually had buildings on our campus. You may remember them as Brown, Green, Morgan, and Monroe. They are where Luddy Hall is today. Those were actually military barracks when they were first built to house people that were here for foreign language training. And the military would send folks here. Once they created their own foreign language training program, they did away with that. Now they only come here for graduate programs. So just last week, I had a brand new Air Force second lieutenant come walking into my office, and she is here for a 2-year German master's program, courtesy of the U.S. Air Force, and that's her first duty assignment. So we are still doing that today for foreign languages. A quick rundown on some things that are a little harder to put into pictures. 1969, as y'all know, in the 60s, ROTC became very unpopular on campus, as the military in general did. The ROTC building was attacked multiple times. The windows were broken out. There was also an attempt at firebombing the building during that time. 1970, IUSA called for the removal of the ROTC program. There's a Bloomington faculty council that discusses the options and tries to figure out what they can do with the program, whether or not they're going to kick it off of campus. But more interestingly, ROTC becomes an independent unit. They're no longer part of the College of Arts and Sciences or any of the schools. They are their own standalone academic unit that reports directly to the administration, which in the long run has proven to be a big boon to them. Because they make a lot of money off the students that they put in those seats, and they get to keep that money and use it for scholarships and programs, much of which supports our veterans on campus. So we have a lot of scholarships for veterans that come out of the funding of the ROTC program. 1993, there's a renewed call for removal of ROTC from campus due to conflict over the Don't Ask, Don't Tell program. That got implemented 2004. When I first started here at IU, we were still sending messages out to IU students warning them that military recruiters were coming to campus and that we understand the military does not have the same values as the institution, but legally we have to let them do this. So if you think about it as a veteran, I show up on campus, I start working at IU, and a week later, somebody forwards me this message from an administrator that warns me the military is coming to campus and doesn't have our values. So interesting thing that goes along with that, in 2004, when I started here, I worked on campus 6 months before I met another veteran, which turned out not to be true. I'd met a lot of them, but nobody owned up to being one. Because we had taken a lot of our veterans and they had chosen to be camouflaged. They had chosen to hide on campus rather than own up, have these conversations, have to talk about these things, deal with the stereotypes and the things that were going on with about it. And if that wasn't enough, in 2008, for those of y'all who may remember, General Peter Pace was given a visiting professorship here at the university for 2 years. He was one of the big proponents of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that became quite a controversy amongst the faculty and became quite a big deal. So those are some of the more recent things. Now, that being said, we have produced, to my knowledge, 67 generals and admirals in IU's history, about 30 of which are still alive. Many of them are the first women and African Americans to hold the positions that they do, and this is just a quick sample of who they are. As I said before, we digitized the Golden Book, and it's now available online at goldenbook.iu.edu. We also have some IU military history. We have some stories of some of our veterans that are listed in there as well. It's just something, if you're curious, you want to know if you have a family member or somebody that's in there, you can just go Google it on the search engine, and it'll tell you if they're in there or not. About 4 years ago now, we brought back our first Veterans Day ceremony on campus. We hadn't had one in about 40 years. And so we started doing a flag raising on Veterans Day at 7:30 in the morning. So that way we're the first event, so we know you're all free. Everybody's available to come. 7:30 in the morning, rain, shine, cold, whatever it is, we're going to be there. We do flag raising ceremony. And the first year that we did this 4 years ago, it was the single biggest social media story of IU for the entire year. They had 3,600 views of the video. So back to the YouTube thing. I know I'm not a YouTube star, right? But this is one of our big events we started doing annually. ROTC supports it. We invite all the campus and community veterans to come out for it. And the number one thing that we hear from alumni is that never would have happened when I was there in the insert 70s, 80s, 90s, right? Really recent history, 9 months ago, we opened the Center for Veteran and Military Students on campus. We're located at the corner of Woodlawn and 11th Street. We are our own facility, our own house. We're not huge, but we're 1,500 square feet. We have a lounge. We do food, snacks. We're also kind of a USO, in a sense, for our military and veteran students, as well as we do all of their processing for GI Bill and veterans benefits. Our Student Veterans of America chapter operates out of there. and that's some of the work that we do. Previously, we were an office attached to the dean's office, and we had been in that role for about 9 years and doing that. And so roughly 10 years ago, we restarted a veterans office on our campus and have been doing this work ever since. That's my full-time gig. That's what I do when I'm not being a history nerd. So I went through all that really fast, and I'm impressed. I managed to get through all my slides relatively where I wanted to be. There was a lot of editing involved in this. So, and I say that because I'm also in the process, I've already submitted a first draft to the IU Press for the Bicentennial. We are working on a book on the military history of IU that'll be a part of the Bicentennial that should be coming out hopefully sometime over the next year and a half or so. My contact information is up here. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always more than happy to help folks with your own personal research. You're trying to track something down on campus or in IU history, or if you think you found something. I'm a big crowdsourcing fan. Anything you find will become something I find. I'll put a slide in about it. I'll give you credit. It's okay. But this is a lot of the work that we do. I do other presentations. I've really focused a lot lately on the Civil War. I'm doing some presentations around the state for the Bicentennial about the IU and the Civil War as well that are just focused on that area. But I'm a generalist in the sense that if it's IU history anytime in the last 200 years, I'm interested, including a time capsule that may be under the Kroger parking lot, may not be, I don't know. But yeah, I have lots of side projects I get pulled into all the time. So at this point, I'll turn it over. Any questions or, yes?
Just an observation. That slide that you had of all the flag officers that were IU alumni, I'm the only person in this room who can say that for a time I dated one of them. Middle row, second in from the right was Carol Eiler, at IU Dental School, classmate of mine, 1975, the first female admiral in the Dental Corps.
Okay, so this is the funny stuff that happens when you do history, and I'm gonna tell you a story. I have his permission to tell the story, even though I didn't record it. So I've been doing these oral histories with a lot of these folks, particularly our generals and admirals. I've been trying to target them. We have a 4-star Air Force General, General Renoir, graduated in '71. And I was doing an oral history with him, and at the end of the oral history, I said, is there anybody else that you think I should interview? And I'd already turned the recorder off, which is the big no-no, right? You're not supposed to do that, but I'd already done it. And he says, do you know Tony Jones? I was like, yes, sir, I know Major General Anthony Jones. Yes, I know who you're talking about. He goes, yeah, you should talk to Tony. If you need his contact information, I'll give it. We were stationed on the same base together for a while. We know each other. And I was like, okay, 4-star Air Force General, 3-star Army General. Maybe not that weird that they know each other. And there's like a pause, and he looks at me and he says, well, okay, so remember when I said I was a student here and I met my wife because she was in a sorority and I worked at the sorority house? And I said, yes. And he says, at the time I met her, she was dating Tony. So it takes about, so I kind of chuckle, and it takes about 10 seconds for this to roll around in my head, and suddenly I'm like, I really want to do an oral history with a woman who dated 2 men in college, and one became a 3-star general and one became a 4-star general, because I really hope she works in HR because she can pick talent, right? Like I really want to meet her, I really want to know her, like I want to do one with her now, right? But yeah, so it is kind of funny to watch. Like they do know each other, they do bump into each other, they see these connections as well. So yes, sir.
For only students who became veterans, or what if a veteran came to IU?
No, it could be a veteran that came to IU. Anybody who was a student and served in the U.S. military. It can be before, after, during. We have also opened it up with the digital version for faculty and staff members as well. And so faculty and staff members who have served in the military can also sign up and enter their information.
So does that automatically then, or does the veteran have to apply with the name?
So you submit stuff, and it comes to my office, and we verify that you were an IU student, and then it's my job to figure out how to verify that you were in the military. Sometimes that's easy. If we've got your records in the IU system, I can verify, okay, you use GI Bill or whatever, then I can do that. If not, sometimes I have to email folks back and forth to get some sort of confirmation about their military service. But that's one of my jobs that happens as well. So, yeah, DD 214 or something like that, yeah. But, yeah.
How many students do you have in the veterans on campus right now?
So right now we have about 540 veterans on the Bloomington campus. We have about 2,200 statewide on all the IU campuses.
Coordination is being done with organizations like the American Legion and your students.
So it just so happens that the vice commander of the American Legion out here is an employee on the IU campus, and his office is like a block and a half down the street from mine. So he stops by on a regular basis. They do a lot with our student veterans organization. Our student veterans organization will often have a cookout out here once a year that they fund and they support as a piece of that. So yeah, it just varies a little bit on kind of what's going on and what's happening. But yeah, they've got a fairly good relationship. Yep. So yeah, so the Alexander Memorial, turns out it's really expensive. I say that half jokingly. We knew it was going into it. We have written some grant proposals, grant requests. We've not been successful with those so far, but we continue to kind of do that. We have a limestone company that's willing to donate the limestone. We have carvers that are willing to do the work, but they need some more information and models and things to go off of in order to do that. So then we just have to pay transportation and engineering and installing and all those sort of things. That's not the attractive piece that everybody wants to fund, right? People want, I bought that stone. That's what people want to do. They don't want to pay to move the stone. So. Yeah, we've got one corner we're still not entirely sure what it originally looked like. And so we're still on the hunt for photographs or sketches of what it was. If not, we may have to just sort of wing it and get an artist that can say, this is what I think it looked like. And yeah, could be. Yep. Yes, sir.
High Bridge, do you know where that is?
I can point to it on a map. It's the question was the Battle of High Bridge. The Battle of High Bridge was, if you go to Appomattox and you look over about 12 miles to the right of Appomattox, 12 miles east of Appomattox, you'll find the Battle of High Bridge there. And there's a town right near there that was also a battle site. But High Bridge was the railroad bridge that crossed over the Appomattox River in that area. So, yeah. Yes?
I was just going to tell you, if you want to look for a couple of those,
Tell us, go to the stoplight there at Hartsford Road and turn left about a mile. There's two of them back in it. They were going to rent them, but then the county.
That's on my road, my neighbors, and it just left, like last year. But I might be able to find out who.
That would be awesome if you could.
They were from they were from the one where the Alumni Center.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that one lasted the longest. That was the,
Green Ghetto,
yeah, that was the longest
I
one.
babysat
Yeah.
my family in that park with my dog.
Yeah, my efforts at finding one in time that we could restore it for the bicentennial and then like stick it somewhere on campus have largely failed. Besides the fact that Kelly keeps telling me like we can't afford that. She told me the same thing about the time capsule, and I'm not one for no for an answer, so I'll just find one and make it happen. So Dean is laughing. So. But yeah, if somebody can ever track one of those down, even to just get some dimensional photographs and stuff to sort of work off of, it would be neat to have that, both for the housing side of campus, but also for the veterans.
Well, I just took a picture of one before we moved.
Oh yeah. Other questions?
thank you for coming.
Yeah, no problem. More than happy.